You see her hands first. They are dusted with flour at the base of the fingers, a little reddened at the knuckles, busy without hurry as they fold a square of clean cloth over a fresh loaf, and then reach for the pantry shelf to set something straight that did not really need setting straight at all. There is something deeply familiar in those hands at work, in the small practiced motions of a woman making a home ready, and tonight they lead us quietly into the pantry of a 1920s bride. If you find this kind of gentle history comforting, please like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels like a place you would like to return to. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from, and what is one pantry item, recipe or kitchen habit you remember from your mother, grandmother, or your own early home that always made a kitchen feel properly stocked. If you like to listen with your eyes closed and no screen at all, this one is on Spotify too, which somehow feels very fitting for a story about shelves, jars, and the quiet order of a well-kept cupboard. So settle in now, and let the thought of a good kitchen come gently forward. Perhaps it is one you remember clearly, or perhaps it is one you can almost remember, with a cool pantry corner, the smell of flour and spice, and the feeling that somebody capable had already thought ahead. What was a young wife expected to keep on hand before the week properly began? What did a stocked pantry mean in a time when there was no quick evening delivery and no cheerful little message saying your order was 10 stops away? How much of homemaking lived not in grand recipes at all, but in jars, crocks, sacks, folded paper parcels, and a knowledge of what would be needed before anyone asked? And how much of that quiet foresight still lives with us now, every time we make sure there is enough tea, enough butter, enough soup for tomorrow? Come with me now, softly, into an American home in the middle of the 1920s. Step across the kitchen threshold and into the year 1925, where the pantry is not just a cupboard of food, but one of the small, steady engines of family life. By the 1920s, many things in American home life were changing. There was more electricity in towns and cities than there had been before, more manufactured goods in stores, more advertising in magazines, more canned foods, more boxed cereals, more branded products promising cleanliness, economy, nourishment, and modern ease. Yet in many homes, especially outside larger cities, a great deal still depended on old skills and careful habits. A pantry was part larder, part supply room, part savings account, and part proof that the household was being run with sense. A bride in the 1920s was often given advice from many directions at once. There were mothers and aunts, of course, each with firm opinions, and not always the same ones. There were church ladies, neighbours, and community cookbooks. There were women's magazines with trim illustrations of tidy kitchens and articles on domestic science, which was the polished modern name for much older household wisdom. There were newspaper columns and mail-order catalogues, and there were those wedding gifts that were really little suggestions in disguise. A flour sifter said one thing, a set of canisters said another, a preserving kettle said, with some authority, that this marriage was expected to include work. What did all this advice circle around? In simple terms, it was this: a capable wife should know how to keep enough food in the house, how to make it last, how to turn it into regular meals, and how to avoid waste. A pantry that was bare, disordered, stale, or unreliable suggested something unsettled. A pantry that was neat and supplied suggested calm, thrift, hospitality, and competence. It meant people would be fed, visitors could be received, children could be managed, and a sudden rainy day would not reduce the household to dry size and one lonely onion. If you like, you can let your eyes rest now and just follow the shelves in your mind. They are simple shelves, but they hold almost the whole rhythm of the week. The word pantry itself covered more than one arrangement. In some homes it was a small separate room, often cooler than the kitchen, sometimes between kitchen and dining room. In other homes it was a built-in cupboard with shelves, drawers, and perhaps a flour bin. In farmhouses and older homes, there might also be a cellar, a back porch, a spring house, or other cool storage places. The ideal pantry was orderly, dry, protected from pests, and arranged so the mistress of the house could see what she had before she forgot she had it. That sounds obvious, but it is the kind of obvious truth every generation rediscovers with great feeling while standing in front of 3 open jars of the same thing. A 1920s bride learning to stock her pantry was really learning several related arts at once. She had to know staple foods, seasonal rhythms, the size and appetites of her household, the local availability of goods, the family budget, and the difference between nice to have and truly necessary. She had to think ahead not just to tomorrow's breakfast but to next Sunday dinner, to company that might appear, to illness, to weather, to the possibility that the grocer might not have exactly what she wanted, or that cash needed to stretch further this month than last. You can imagine her first months in a new home. Maybe she is newly married in a small town, in a rented house with a narrow pantry off the kitchen. Maybe she is in a city apartment with less space but easier access to shops. Maybe she is on a farm, where the distance to town gives every shelf a little more importance. However modern the decade might seem in its jazz and automobiles and bright department store windows, a great many meals still depended on what was already in the house, and what could be made from it without much fuss. The staples came first. Flour was one of the great anchors of the pantry. Not because every woman baked every day in quite the same way, but because flour could become bread, biscuits, pie crust, cakes, dumplings, gravies, pancakes, and all sorts of practical little rescues when the meal needed extending. In some kitchens it lived in its paper sack until used. In others it was poured into a tin-lined flour bin built into the pantry cabinet, with a little slide or scoop. Keeping flour fresh and dry mattered. Dampness was the enemy. So were mice, weevils, and carelessness. A bride who knew to watch flour closely knew something useful about home already. Beside the flour there would often be cornmeal, perhaps oatmeal, maybe rice, and very likely some form of breakfast cereal as packaged foods became more common. The 1920s pantry was not purely old-fashioned nor purely modern. It was a mixture. One shelf might hold a sack of sugar and a crock of lard, while another held a box of crackers from the store and a tin of cocoa with handsome printed lettering. This was part of the charm of the era. A home could be moving forward into modern convenience while still leaning on habits old enough to belong to a grandmother. Sugar was another essential, and usually more than one kind if the household could manage it. White granulated sugar for everyday sweetening and baking, brown sugar for certain cakes, cookies, puddings and sauces, powdered sugar if one liked a proper finish. Sugar was not simply for treats. It was a preserving agent, a dependable contributor to jam, jelly, canned fruit, and all the little sweetings that made plain food kinder. A spoonful of sugar in stewed fruit, in oatmeal, in a simple cake for company, had a usefulness beyond indulgence. It softened the rough edges of economy. Salt was necessary in ways almost too basic to notice until it was missing. Table salt for the dining table, salt for cooking, sometimes coarser salt for preserving or pickling, depending on the household's work. Pepper too, though seasoning in many ordinary homes was plainer than later generations might expect. You did not need an entire spinning rack of 27 little bottles looking as if they had ambitions of running a restaurant. But certain spices had pride of place: cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, allspice, perhaps mustard, maybe paprika. Vanilla, if it could be afforded, had a place of honor. These small brown bottles and folded packets carried a great deal of comfort in very little space. Tea and coffee mattered very much, and listeners of a certain good sense will not be surprised by that. A pantry did not need to be luxurious, but it needed to be able to produce a warm drink. Coffee was deeply woven into many households, especially in the morning and at meal times. Tea, too, had its place, depending on region, family habit, and background. Cocoa was especially welcome in cooler weather and for children. A bride was expected to know not only whether her husband took coffee, but how strong, and whether her mother-in-law preferred tea in the afternoon, and would notice if the tin was nearly empty. History is often told through treaties and elections, but a surprising amount of domestic peace has rested quietly on beverage timing. Then there were fats, so practical and so central. Butter, of course, where refrigeration allowed and means permitted. Lard was still common and useful for pastry, frying, biscuits, and all sorts of cooking. In some homes, bacon fat was carefully saved and used. Vegetable shortenings had become increasingly common in the early 20th century, marketed as modern, clean, and reliable. Cooking oils were present too, though in many kitchens the range of fats was narrower than what we know now. The point was not novelty, it was usefulness. A pantry had to support daily cooking, and fat was fuel in more ways than one. You would likely find baking powder and baking soda, both important and not to be confused. Yeast too, fresh or dry, depending on baking habits and local access. Vinegar was nearly indispensable, useful in pickles, dressings, cleaning, and practical household magic of various unadvertised kinds. Molasses might stand dark and patient in the pantry, ready for gingerbread or brown bread or baked beans, or simply because it had always belonged there. Syrup, perhaps, honey in some homes. These were not decorative ingredients. They were the backbone of everyday cooking. Beans and dried peas appeared in many cupboards, especially where thrift mattered closely. Navy beans, lima beans, split peas. Dried beans could be transformed into filling meals with a ham bone, an onion, a little molasses, a little mustard, a bit of salt pork if available. Rice could stretch leftovers. Crackers could accompany soup or be crushed for crumbs. Macaroni and noodles had become familiar in many places too, useful and filling. Potatoes, onions, and sometimes apples might be kept not on the pantry shelf itself, but in a cool adjoining place, because these too were household anchors. Canned goods deserve a quiet little shelf of their own in this story. By the 1920s, commercial canned foods were well established in American life, and many homes used them gladly. Tomatoes were especially useful, appearing in soups, sauces, casseroles, and all manner of practical dishes. Canned corn, peas, peaches, pears, salmon, sardines, soups, evaporated milk, and condensed milk might all find their way into a pantry depending on budget and taste. To us, a can opener is so ordinary it barely exists in the mind. But in this period, canned food represented a real measure of convenience and security. It brought summer produce into winter. It allowed a woman to make a meal on a day when she was tired, unwell, or behind. It was not quite instant, but it was a respectable shortcut. At the same time, many households still did home canning. If you walk a little farther in your imagination, past the daily shelf goods, you might see rows of glass jars, fruit put up in season, jam and jelly catching the light, tomatoes in their own juice, pickles, relishes, perhaps chow-chow, if the family liked it, perhaps preserves from berries or peaches if there had been enough fruit and enough time. Those jars held the memory of summer labour and the promise of winter meals. They were colour in a plain season and evidence of foresight. A bride who knew how to can safely and successfully carried a prized skill, though not every young woman began marriage knowing all of it at once. Many learned by doing, by watching older hands, by trial, by correction, and by the annual rhythm that came around whether one felt entirely ready or not. A pantry was also expected to support baking for ordinary life and for company. Cookies kept in tins, a plain cake that could be made on short notice, pie ingredients for Sunday dinner or visitors, dried fruits such as raisins, currants, prunes, or dates, might be tucked away for puddings, breads, fruitcake, or simple compotes. Gelatin was increasingly common in this era as well, opening the door to molded desserts and salads that once seemed modern enough to deserve applause. Some of those dishes remain a little mysterious in retrospect, and one can only admire the confidence with which households once suspended ingredients in cheerful uncertainty and served them with full sincerity. Still, the heart of stocking the pantry was not display, it was planning. That was one of the great expectations placed on a bride. To plan meals, to anticipate needs, to keep track of dwindling supplies, to know when to buy, how much to buy, and whether this week called for thrift or could bear a little generosity. The pantry was where domestic arithmetic lived. If there was roast on Sunday, there might be hash or soup or sandwiches after. If fruit was abundant in August, jars must be found and sugar bought before the season slipped away. If a child was ill, broth and crackers might be needed. If snow threatened, the shelves had to be checked. If the minister called unexpectedly, there ought to be something respectable to place beside his cup. Many newly married women in the 1920s were managing this within a budget that was exacting rather than roomy. Even where prosperity touched a household, waste was frowned upon. In homes of modest means, waste could not be tolerated at all. So stocking the pantry was never simply a shopping matter. It was a thrift matter, a moral matter in the old household sense, though not necessarily spoken aloud that way every day. To buy sensibly, store carefully, rotate what was on hand, and use leftovers well was considered part of good management. In magazine advice of the time, the efficient housewife appears often, calm, tidy, prepared, and able to produce a satisfying meal without theatrical distress. You can almost hear the pantry door open and close, the soft thump of a sack set down, the little dry whisper of paper around crackers, the clink of jars touching. These are small sounds, but they are the soundtrack of preparedness, and if they soothe you, you can simply keep listening and drift a little deeper into them. Shopping itself looked different depending on place and income. In some towns, a woman might order regularly from a grocer who knew the family and perhaps extended credit until the husband's payday. Goods might be delivered by wagon or truck. In a city, she might visit neighborhood shops more frequently and buy smaller quantities because storage space was limited. On a farm, larger stores of staples made more sense, especially in winter. Some families bought flour and sugar in bulk. Others had to buy smaller amounts as money allowed. A bride had to learn not only what was ideal, but what was possible in her own kitchen, on her own shelves, with her own purse. Branding and advertising played an increasing role in shaping what women thought a pantry should contain. Companies promoted packaged flour, baking powder, cereals, canned soups, gelatin, cocoa, coffee, and all manner of household goods directly to women. Ads often promised better nutrition, more modern housekeeping, cleaner food, less labor, and family approval. There is a tender little comedy in this, because every age seems convinced that a product on a shelf might finally make domestic life perfectly smooth. The women of the 1920s were practical enough to know better, but they were also interested in convenience, and who could blame them? A can of soup did not replace all labor, but on a long day, it may have felt like the gentlest kind of assistance. Domestic science courses and home economics classes also shaped expectations for young brides. By the 1920s, many girls in school were taught principles of nutrition, sanitation, meal planning, and household management. This sat side by side with inherited knowledge from home, so a bride might know from a textbook that foods were grouped by nutritive value, and from her mother that there should always be enough flour for biscuits if weather or company turned suddenly. One form of wisdom did not cancel the other. In many homes they mixed together much like old aprons and new electric irons, each finding its place. Nutrition had become a more explicit topic by then. There was growing public interest in balanced meals, vitamins, fresh foods, and the health of children. But the language of nutritional science reached the table in everyday forms. More milk when possible, vegetables in season, fruit preserved for winter, cereals for breakfast, eggs for nourishment, soup as something restorative, bread as something steady. A pantry that supported health did not necessarily look fussy or specialized. It looked useful. Useful then often meant wholesome. The daily rhythm of the pantry began early. In the morning, breakfast might require oatmeal, cereal, flour for pancakes or biscuits, sugar, coffee, jam, perhaps canned fruit in winter. The pantry was opened before full daylight in some seasons, with a lamp lit or the kitchen just beginning to pale blue at the window. The woman of the house moved toward it as naturally as breathing. Even in homes where a husband or older children helped with chores, she was usually expected to carry the household memory. She knew which shelf held the cornmeal, which jar was nearly empty, which can had been saved for Sunday. By noon, the pantry was consulted again. What could become dinner? What needed using up? Was there bread enough? If not, should biscuits be made? Was there soup in the cellar? Beans from yesterday? Canned peaches for dessert? Crackers for the little one? Cocoa for the schoolchild chilled from the walk home? Supper asked the same questions in a new tone. At the end of the day, the pantry answered with whatever foresight had placed there in quieter hours. This is one of the things that makes the history of pantry stocking so intimate. It is not only about ingredients. It is about memory and timing, about the invisible labor of remembering before anyone else remembers, about knowing the household from the inside. To stand in that pantry is to stand in the mind of the home. A young bride was expected to develop systems, even if she did not use that word. She learned where to put things so they could be reached easily and found in poor light. Frequently used goods at hand, special ingredients a bit higher up, cleaning cloths separate from food, matches safely stored, potatoes cool and dark, onions aired, bread kept from drying if possible, cookies hidden well enough to last longer than a morning, though not so well that the lady of the house forgot them herself, which has happened in every century. Containers mattered: glass jars, tin canisters, enamel bins, crocks, paper sacks folded down neatly, lidded boxes. Each had its purpose. Canisters for tea, coffee, sugar, flour, jars for spices, dried goods and leftovers of a sort, crocks for pickles, preserves or rendered fat, tin bread boxes in some kitchens. A neat pantry was not merely prettier, it was easier to clean, easier to inspect, and easier to trust. That mattered when there were no plastic zip bags, no cling film, no labels printed with exact dates, and certainly no little refrigerator drawer politely marked deli. Cleanliness was a constant concern, though not in the anxious modern way of disinfecting everything in sight until the whole kitchen smells as if it ought to be wearing shoes. It was practical cleanliness. Shelves were wiped, crumbs were watched, spills were not allowed to linger and invite insects, jars were checked, cloths were boiled or scrubbed. Airing out happened when weather permitted. A pantry had to be kept sweet, and sweet here meant fresh and sound, not scented with anything ambitious. If there was a stale smell, a damp corner, signs of pests, or a sticky shelf, action was required. This was part of good housekeeping as much as baking a pie. Season shaped everything. In summer, the pantry brimmed with possibility and pressure. Fruit and vegetables came in fast, and if the household meant to preserve them, there was no dawdling. Sugar had to be bought, jars and lids prepared, kettles set to boiling. The kitchen grew warm, and the work was repetitive, sticky, and strangely satisfying. Rows of filled jars cooling on towels gave a kind of visual peace, the peace of looking ahead and seeing winter already softened. In autumn, root vegetables, apples, squashes, and late preserves settled in. In winter, the pantry became more heavily relied upon. In spring, supplies might run low and meals grow plainer until green things returned. If the bride lived on a farm or near family land, pantry knowledge blended with garden knowledge. She needed to understand when produce would be ready, how much the family used in a year, and what should be eaten fresh versus preserved. Green beans could be canned. Corn could be canned or dried in some communities. Apples might become sauce, butter, preserves, dried slices, pies. Cucumbers became pickles. Cabbage might become relish or slaw. Tomatoes were especially valued because they worked so hard in the kitchen, appearing in soup, sauces, stews, and side dishes with very little complaint. In more urban homes where gardening might be limited or absent, the pantry leaned more heavily on the market and on commercially preserved foods. But the principle stayed the same. The good housekeeper was expected to think ahead and keep useful things close by. A bag of potatoes, a loaf of bread, evaporated milk, a can of tomatoes, rice, sugar, onions, flour, butter if there was an icebox and the means to keep it supplied with ice. The exact arrangement changed, but the pantry's purpose did not. The icebox is worth pausing beside for a moment. In 1925, many households still used iceboxes rather than electric refrigerators. Though electrification and modern appliances were spreading, the icebox changed how perishable items were managed, but it did not remove the pantry's importance. In fact, it made the distinction clearer. Fresh meat, milk, butter, leftovers, and certain produce might depend on ice. Dry goods and preserves depended on proper pantry storage. The bride had to know both worlds. She had to know what belonged cool, what belonged dry, and what had better be used at once before it turned and spoiled the day's plans. You can picture the kitchen now, perhaps with white enamelware, a checked curtain, a sturdy table scarred by honest use, the smell of coffee and bread, and that pantry close by like a faithful assistant. There is no need to hurry through it. The slower you move here, the more familiar it becomes. The pantry also reflected social expectations about hospitality. A respectable home should be able to offer something, not a banquet every time someone came by, but something: cake, cookies, preserves, bread and butter, perhaps pickles or a relish tray at a meal, coffee or tea with a little plate beside it. The stocked pantry gave a woman confidence. She did not have to apologize for being caught unprepared if she had flour, sugar, eggs, and a little imagination. Company cake recipes existed for a reason. So did cookie tins. So did the firm belief that one must never look as if one had been put out, even when one very much had been. Many brides learned pantry habits in the homes where they had grown up. As girls, they had fetched sugar, sifted flour, polished tins, strung dried apples, shelled peas, and watched mothers and grandmothers estimate quantities by eye. A cup was a cup, yes, but a hand had its own measurements too. A pinch, a small handful, enough to fill the bowl so far. The pantry was often one of the first rooms where children were trusted with useful errands, and therefore one of the first rooms where they learned household order. Bring the baking powder, fetch the cinnamon, count the jars, do not slam the door, do not dip your fingers in the sugar. That last instruction, one suspects, has always had to be repeated. Marriage made those childhood observations suddenly practical. A new wife might discover that understanding a pantry from the outside was different from managing it herself. She had to notice how quickly coffee disappeared, how many potatoes a family actually ate, whether her husband liked cornbread with beans or preferred biscuits, whether Sunday supper needed more than leftovers because callers stayed longer than expected, how much flour vanished in holiday baking. These are not glamorous discoveries, but they are the true furniture of domestic knowledge. Economy often meant using what was on hand before buying more. Stale bread became toast, crumbs, dressing, pudding, or scallop dishes. Bones became broth. Bacon drippings flavored vegetables. Sour milk could be used in baking. Overripe fruit became sauce or preserves if caught in time. The pantry supported this thrift because it held the ingredients that turned leftovers into proper meals. Flour for thickening, rice for stretching, spices for reviving, sugar for preserving, vinegar for balancing, crackers for making something seem intentional. A well-stocked pantry allowed a woman to rescue supper from circumstances with very little fanfare. Recipe books of the era reveal this practical genius. They are full of dishes designed to use leftovers, extend expensive ingredients, and make plain foods attractive. Creamed dishes over toast, hashes, soups, custards, puddings, fruit desserts, gingerbread, simple cookies, cakes measured carefully because butter cost money, and eggs mattered. The pantry fed both necessity and pleasure. One shelf held duty, another held comfort. Often they were the same shelf. There was also the matter of preserving family taste. A bride marrying into a family was often expected, gently or not so gently, to learn how things were done in that house. Maybe her husband liked his mother's pickles. Maybe there was a family cake for holidays. Maybe beans were always sweetened a certain way, or preserves were never made from one fruit but always from another. Pantry stocking was part of this inheritance. It was a way of saying, without words, this home will continue, though under new hands. At the same time, brides brought their own habits with them. A woman raised in one region might stock differently in another. Immigrant households carried pantry traditions from Europe, the Mediterranean, Latin America, or elsewhere into American kitchens, blending old country tastes with New World ingredients and local availability. A pantry in a Scandinavian home might not look quite like one in an Italian, Jewish, Southern, Midwestern, or Appalachian home. Even within one town, there would be differences in bread, fats, preserves, grains, spices, coffee habits, and holiday stores. So when we say what a 1920s bride was expected to know, we are speaking about a broad pattern, not a single exact shelf arrangement in every house. The shared expectation was competence. The details were personal and local and full of family character. The pantry could also reveal aspiration. A newly married woman might begin with only the most basic staples and hope to add more as means improved. Nice canisters, a better spice set, more regular canned fruits, a prettier cake tin, perhaps a pressure canner, or a more efficient cabinet. Household magazines encouraged this gradual refinement, often with a bright confidence that better storage solutions could improve life itself. Sometimes they could. Anyone who has ever decanted something into a proper jar and felt suddenly more capable knows there is a little truth in it. A bride was expected to know that pantry stocking was not done once and forgotten. It was a cycle: inspection, replenishing, cleaning, arranging, using, planning, and beginning again. Saturday might bring baking and restocking. Monday perhaps washing. Another day shopping, another day preserving in season. The pantry was touched by every household task. If she mended aprons, the pantry still mattered because she needed a clean place for cloths. If she scrubbed floors, crumbs under pantry bins needed attending. If she planned menus, pantry stock determined what was sensible. Homework was webbed together like that. Tug one string, and the pantry door opened somewhere. And then there was weather, such a quiet ruler of old domestic life. Damp weather threatened dry goods. Heat challenged butter and milk. Snow and mud affected shopping. Storms made preparedness visible. A woman who checked her shelves before bad weather was not being dramatic. She was being sensible. Flour, lamp oil, sugar, coffee, beans, potatoes, salt. These had a reassuring weight in uncertain weather. The modern equivalent may be a full kettle and enough soup in the freezer, but the instinct is the same. We sleep better when the house feels ready. The skill involved in all this was often invisible because it was ordinary. No brass band followed a woman who noticed the baking powder was low before Sunday morning. No civic plaque was issued because she kept mice out of the flour bin or remembered to save jars in spring. Yet this kind of attention made home life smoother for everyone else. The very invisibility was part of the work. Things did not become emergencies because she had anticipated them. That is one of the quiet dignities of domestic labor. When done well, it can look effortless from across the room. If you are growing sleepy now, you can simply let the story carry you. There is no test at the end of the pantry shelf, only the soft reassurance of one jar beside another and the knowledge that someone in this old kitchen knew exactly what she was doing. Cookbooks and women's magazines often advised brides to keep written household accounts, food expenses, quantities purchased, weekly menus, seasonal preserving tallies. Not every woman did so in a formal way, but many kept some record, a little notebook in a drawer, a pencil-marked list, a memorandum tucked behind the canister. This helped avoid waste and guided future buying. If 10 pounds of sugar disappeared too quickly during preserving season, next year she would know. If one brand of flour suited her better, she remembered. If holiday baking required more raisins than expected, the pantry taught her that too. The pantry also held non-food items in many homes, though usually in careful separation. Soap, starch, bluing, candles, matches, wax paper, brown paper, twine, extra cloths, perhaps a mop head or polish, depending on the arrangement of the house. The pantry, in an older sense, was part household supply centre, and a woman was expected to manage these stores with the same careful eye as food. Running out of soap on wash day could throw the whole week into disorder. Running out of matches was a small domestic disgrace, only until it happened, and then it became a lesson never forgotten. Children interacted with the pantry in lively ways. It was the place where treats might be kept, where cookies cooled in tins, where jam was ladled, where after-school hunger arrived at speed. It was also a place of caution. Do not upset the jar. Do not spill the flour. Do not leave the door open. In homes with several children, a mother's pantry management included defense strategies known best to herself. The top shelf, the back corner, the jar that looked dull but held the nicest thing, the cake kept under a cloth in a place no one would think to look. A pantry was not a battlefield exactly, but it did reward strategy. Holidays gave the pantry a special glow. Weeks before Christmas or Thanksgiving, shelves might gather extra sugar, spices, nuts, raisins, candied peel, chocolate, coffee, flour, and special canned or preserved fruits. The pantry then became a storehouse of anticipation. You could smell cinnamon before the pie was baked, because the spice had already entered the room. You could hear paper rustling around hidden gifts or ingredients bought for company. In many homes, abundance was relative, but even modest abundance had a festive air. One extra orange, one precious tin, one carefully saved jar of preserves could make the season feel touched with plenty. For a bride, the first holiday pantry in her own home must have felt especially meaningful. To stock for guests, to plan baking, to produce a meal that carried family feeling forward. All this said, she was now not just somebody's daughter visiting the old kitchen, but the woman of this one. There is tenderness in that, and a little pressure too. Yet so much of it was carried by habit. Mix, stir, store, check, cover, count, remember. Hands learn, shelves teach. Even the appearance of the pantry mattered in small ways. Neatness was associated with moral steadiness and self-respect in a way that modern people sometimes find strict, but it also had a simple emotional truth. Order can be comforting. To open a cupboard and see canisters aligned, jars clean, sacks folded, and a loaf under a cloth gives a feeling larger than the objects themselves. It says the day can proceed. It says there is a plan. It says somebody cared enough to put things right. Many listeners know that feeling without needing a lecture about it. A bride was often cautioned not to overstock beyond what could be used. This was partly economy, partly practicality. Dry goods could spoil, fats could turn rancid, pests could arrive, and money tied up on a shelf could not be spent elsewhere. So one of the expected skills was judgment. Enough, but not foolishly too much. Variety, but not extravagance. Preparedness, but not clutter. This balancing act is timeless. Every kitchen teaches it. Every grocery bill repeats it in a new accent. In communities where neighbors exchanged food and advice, the pantry was also social. A borrowed cup of sugar, a jar of preserves shared, pickles traded, yeast given, recipes discussed over back steps. No home stood entirely alone. Brides learned from older women around them, not just from books. Someone might tell her which pickling cucumber held its crunch, which grocer kept the freshest coffee, which shelf in that particular house stayed coolest in August, or how to keep cake moist under a bell jar. These tiny transmissions of knowledge are part of the real history of women's lives, passed hand to hand without much ceremony. When money was short, the pantry could be adjusted with ingenuity rather than panic. More beans, fewer meats. More puddings, simpler cakes. Bread made at home if possible. Soups extended. Seasonal produce relied on more heavily. The expectation remained that a woman would manage with grace. That expectation could be burdensome, yes, but within it there was also admirable resourcefulness. A great many homes were made warm and dependable by women who knew how to turn small stores into satisfying meals, and did so without much applause. And still, amid all this practicality, the pantry had pleasures. The cool, dim smell when the door first opened, the jewel colours of jelly jars, the satisfying heft of a full sugar canister, the little crackle of waxed paper, the comfort of seeing enough tea for the week, the secret delight of knowing there was a cake in the tin. These are small joys, but they are true joys. Ordinary life has always relied on them more than on grand occasions. As the 1920s went on, newer kitchen designs increasingly emphasized efficiency. Built-in cabinets, labeled containers, work triangles before they were formally called that, and labor-saving devices all found their champions. The famous idea of the kitchen as a rational workspace appealed to reformers and manufacturers alike. Yet whatever the architects drew, the soul of the pantry remained human. A shelf is only a shelf until someone knows what belongs on it and why. The expertise was not in the cabinet maker's plan alone, but in the woman who could reach into that cabinet, half awake, and still produce breakfast. Some brides likely embraced these expectations eagerly. Others may have felt uncertain, bored, proud, overwhelmed, or all four in one afternoon. It is worth remembering that the women of the 1920s were not all cut from one cloth, however neatly folded. Some loved baking, some did not. Some were naturally orderly, some learned order by necessity. Some lived with mothers or mothers-in-law who guided them closely. Some had to invent their own methods in relative isolation. History is gentler and more truthful when it allows women to be individuals within the pattern. Still, the pattern matters. Society expected a bride to know, or quickly learn, how to stock and manage a pantry because feeding the household was fundamental work. It affected health, hospitality, spending, routine, and morale. In a time before convenience became as swift and casual as it is now, the pantry stood between the family and uncertainty. If the shelf was sound, the day was easier. Listen a moment longer to the kitchen around you. The clock ticks. A spoon touches a bowl. Somewhere, a screen door taps faintly and then rests. The pantry stands cool and still, not glamorous, not dramatic, and all the more beloved for it. Let us linger with one imagined 1925 bride for a little while, because broad history becomes most comforting when it settles into one kitchen. She has been married perhaps 6 months. Her kitchen is not large, but it is hers to manage. There is a window over the sink. There is a plain table scrubbed pale. There is a narrow pantry with shelves her husband put up a little sturdier after the first week when she looked at them thoughtfully, and they understood one another without speech. She begins the week by taking stock. The flour is low but not alarming, sugar enough for a few days. Coffee nearly out, which will not do. She has canned tomatoes, a jar of peach preserves from her mother, onions in a basket, potatoes keeping well, half a crock of lard, a little rice, dried beans, cocoa, oats, baking powder, and a precious tin of tea for visitors, or for when she wants the afternoon to feel gentler than it does. She writes a small list: coffee, sugar, maybe raisins if there is room in the budget, and soap. As she plans meals, the pantry becomes a partner. Beans one night with brown bread, fried potatoes with eggs another, Sunday roast if possible, then leftovers made useful on Monday, soup from the bone, tomatoes with macaroni, a simple cake if company comes. She is learning that a pantry does not have to be overflowing to be competent. It has to be understood. On wash day she is too tired for anything ambitious. The sheets are on the line, the kitchen already feels worked over, and the pantry rescues her. Crackers, canned soup, bread, jam, maybe baked apples if she has the energy to set them in the oven. This is where pantry wisdom shows its kind face. It does not always ask for excellence. Sometimes it simply offers enough. In summer she learns preserving from an older neighbour who comes over tying on her apron with the authority of one who has seen many peaches behave badly. Together they scald jars, cut fruit, measure sugar, wipe rims, and listen for the small, satisfying seal after cooling. The kitchen is hot, their foreheads shine. Somebody laughs when syrup sticks to the handle of a drawer. By evening the shelves hold bright jars in rows, and the young bride feels richer than the bank account suggests. She has stored time itself. At least, that is how it feels in August. By autumn she notices she no longer hesitates before the pantry. Her hands go where they mean to go. She reaches for cinnamon without searching. She knows which shelf takes the extra loaf. She rotates the canned goods. She keeps a jar for drippings, one for crumbs. She remembers to buy extra flour before bad weather. This is how domestic knowledge arrives. Not all at once, quietly, through repetition so ordinary that one day it simply becomes part of the body. And if you are half asleep now, that is perfectly all right. You can let her continue at her shelves while you rest. She has this well in hand. It is tempting in modern life to imagine the past in extremes, either charmingly simple or terribly difficult. But most kitchens were neither fantasy nor tragedy. They were workplaces full of habit, smell, weather, and negotiation. The 1920s pantry was not a museum display of quaint objects. It was active, practical, and alive to the household's changing needs. It held the ingredients of plain suppers and birthday cakes, of nursing the sick and feeding extra mouths, of holiday bustle and rainy day improvisation. There was dignity in knowing how to keep such a place. Not grand public dignity, but household dignity. The kind that lives in folded sacks, dry shelves, and a loaf saved for tomorrow. A bride was expected to bring or learn this knowledge because it was how a home steadied itself. The work was repetitive, yes, but repetition is often how care looks up close. Toward the end of the decade, new appliances and changing lifestyles would continue to reshape domestic life. Refrigerators would spread more widely, packaged foods would increase, shopping patterns would gradually shift. But the old pantry logic endured. Keep staples, know your household, plan ahead, waste little, offer hospitality, store comfort where you can reach it. Those principles outlasted the labels on the tins, and in a quiet way, they still sit with us now. Most of us, whatever our kitchens look like, still feel better when there is tea in the cupboard, bread for the morning, soup for a tired day, something small for a guest, something dependable when weather turns or energy drops. We still know the relief of opening a cabinet and finding what we hoped was there. We still inherit habits from mothers, grandmothers, fathers, aunts, neighbours, from our own younger selves trying to make a home work with what was on hand. A modern pantry may have pasta instead of dried beans, boxed broth instead of a stock pot on the back of the stove, peanut butter instead of a crock of drippings, but the instinct is wonderfully familiar. It is still the instinct to care ahead of time. That may be why stories like this feel so close. The jars change, the brands change, the kitchen paint changes, but the small acts of readiness do not vanish. Someone still checks whether there is enough coffee. Someone still keeps a little something for visitors. Someone still saves the last bit of soup because tomorrow might be busy. Someone still feels a hush of satisfaction when the shelves are straightened and the week looks possible. Across a century, that quiet domestic intelligence reaches out and feels almost like recognition. So tonight, as the old pantry door closes softly in the year 1925, let that steady little room remain with you. The cool shelf, the folded cloth, the canister set back in its place by careful hands. Thank you for spending this time with me, and until we meet again, good night. May your own home, however old or new, feel gently ready for morning.